Al, thank you so much for being here with us today. Can you give us just a quick overview of who you are and what you do at
Yep.
Sherlock?
Yep. I'm a fractional CFO. I've worked in big blue chip corporations and more latterly worked in small startups and growing businesses.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So you're here today with us to help us understand how SMEs can optimize working capital. So why did you pick this topic? Why do you think it's something that needs to be talked about?
I think it's important because growing businesses, people typically think that if they're growing a business, they don't need finance because they're growing, so they must be making lots of cash. The challenge is many businesses have something called a working capital needs, which is effectively financing for effectively to support their customers' receipts and for stock and inventory, which effectively requires finance, and that's offset to some extent by what they owe suppliers. And the net of that is effectively their working capital. What that means, though, is as they grow in revenue and grow in turnover, the more business they do, those working capital needs grow in effectively in proportion to that. Therefore, if you think you've got enough finance, running at a turnover of X, if you double that, you need more finance, and that's important to understand that before you get to that position when you run out of cash.
Okay. Do you feel that SME leaders or founders sometimes do not get the implications and the importance of working capital? And if yes, why is that? Do they lack education, support?
I think it's something that you just think, well, if you're a growing business, you don't need finance because you're making cash and everything. Because if you look at the profit and loss account, yep, it looks like you're profitable, but when you look at the balance sheet, that's where your demands for cash are shown and show up effectively in working capital. Um, and sometimes you are not in control of, when a supplier pays you. Often you have a supplier. If you're a small business, it may well be a large business. They don't historically pay on time, and you're out of control. You don't have control around that. You may have a little bit of control around when you pay your suppliers, um, and things like inventory. You've got to manage that as well. And of course, that is where you've got to put your money as well.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit more about why is that specifically a problem for SMEs? Is it because that they do not necessarily have an internal finance director or CFO?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, a lot of smaller businesses will be looking at their cash flows, and they'll be managing their money, over the next month or 2 months, and they've got a nice cash flow forecast. But if you're projecting further than that, you can start to think about, I suppose, strategically what your working capital needs are, and therefore plan further ahead so that you're not at that point where you need cash, and you're asking for it when you're in a hole. It's better to have planned this out and thought about those financing needs in advance.
Okay, so can you run us through a little bit what this, planning ahead would look like concretely?
Yeah, I think it's looking at your business and understanding, right. I mean, you can break it down into, how many days, typically debtor days is what it's called. So what your customers owe you, and that's typically and how many days they typically pay you, and that might be 60 to 90 days. You may have stock which is 60 to 90 days because your stock turnover is you go through your stock over 60 to 90 days. But you may have creditors and you pay those over, say, 30 to 60 days. And you can look how you've historically, looking at your balance sheet, you can look at historically how you have, what your effectively your debtor, creditor, and stock inventory days are. And if you net that down, that produces your working capital needs. And from there, you can work out, well, if you're going to double your turnover, there's an implication there on your cash flow needs, and you can work it out that way. And that's a different way from building up from the bottom, saying, well, I need to pay this person, next week, and this person's cash will come in the following week. A sort of bottom up. By looking at a working capital way what I've just described, you're looking at top down, and you can look much further. You can look much further out, basically.
Okay. Okay. And do you think that's something like, I imagine like typically most SMEs on the smaller side without a structured finance department will have external accountants. Do accountants work with them in that regard? Can they help, or is that something that
they do, and that's something certainly that the finance directors or external advisors can advise on, but it needs someone to be thinking about that. So when you're a CEO running around thinking about doing all these things, talking to clients, building products, this may be not something that comes to the fore, where it's not front of mind. Whereas if you are a finance director or an advisor, you will be thinking about those cash flow needs.
okay? Um, Can you tell us a bit more about your experience, working with small businesses on how the mismanagement of, or, the good management of working capital in effect impacts an SME? And do your general opinion on trends and statistically, do most SMEs deal with it pretty well, or is that one of the key reasons for bankruptcy?
I think there are some statistics which say effectively cash flow is the thing that kills a business, and often it's called overtrading, where you have expanded too quickly and you haven't considered your working capital needs. So it does happen. In my experience, clearly one of the things that small businesses need is someone focusing on the cash and being able to look at that strategically as far out as possible is important, and ensuring you got the financing in place before you get into that hole is important as well.
Okay. So what would be your advice for like an SME leader that precisely doesn't necessarily understand the importance of working capital? Like you don't know what you don't know, so we're kind
Yeah.
of like a loophole here.
Well, listen to this video and then go and speak to people and get advice and make sure you've got a focus on that. A finance manager should, if you've got a finance manager working your business, they should understand this, but they may not have the time to focus in on it. And that's the challenge is thinking about what your financing needs are before it's too late. So I think go out there, seek advice, get some expertise in, and it's something that you need to just keep on top of as the business grows.
Okay. And imagine we have SME leaders looking at this interview and listening in. On a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being incredibly easy, 10 being incredibly difficult, where do they stand in terms of actually being able to grasp this topic quickly and handle it?
I think once they understand those basic things where you've got money tied up in your, what your customers owe you and stock, I think once you've explained that, I think the concept's reasonably straightforward. The difficulty or the challenge is spending time to work out what those needs are as the business grows, and having someone there focused in on that, and it's typically in the finance area. And I know a lot of CEOs who do everything and are looking at eye on finance and everything. But that's it may be that as you start to grow, some of those things you want to get dedicate to people that you hire or you give to advisors,
Mm.
depending what size you are, of course.
Yeah, I think there is this typical. We published a blog post about that. This like space for SME between 2 million and a 4 million turnover, where actually they're too big to handle things the good old-fashioned
Yeah.
way when one
Yep.
person was doing everything, but they are not big enough to actually have
Yeah.
internal resources. So they stay in this like very dangerous
Yes.
zone where any investment actually is not profitable and doesn't bring any return,
Yeah.
which is the case of having a finance person. So
But it's just to be aware of that. And I think it's an important thing that, often you're so focused on the product and sales and everything that you've got to think about the cash flow, because that's the bit that will switch off the business instantly if you don't have it.
Fantastic.